The mare was standing right there in the middle of the road, her chestnut coat catching the last red light of the dying sun, and Lucy Holloway could not breathe. She had not breathed properly in 11 days. 11 days since Colt Macready and his gang of hired snakes had ridden through Redemption Creek like a fever, taking whatever they wanted: grain, silver, dignity, and the one thing Lucy could not afford to lose: her mare, her Rosie. The animal she had raised from a foal, the horse that had carried her from Missouri to Texas after her mother died, and her father's debts swallowed every last possession except that one stubborn, wild-eyed filly Lucy had refused to surrender. Now Rosie stood in the center of the road outside the Redemption Creek livery, bridle freshly replaced, mane combed, mud cleaned from her legs, and holding her reins was a man Lucy had never spoken more than 4 words to in her life: Harlan Collier, the gunslinger the whole town whispered about and nobody trusted. His hat was pulled low. Dust coated the shoulders of his dark coat. He had clearly ridden hard, and recently his horse behind him was still blowing steam through dilated nostrils. There was a cut above Harlan's left eyebrow that had dried dark, and his jaw was set in that particular way a man holds himself when he expects to be misunderstood and has made his peace with it. Lucy came off her porch in 3 fast steps. The neighbors who had been watching from behind curtained windows leaned closer. The general store owner, Mr. Delacroix, stepped outside but did not come any nearer. Nobody wanted to be close to Harlan Collier in case whatever trouble followed him had not finished arriving. "You have my horse," Lucy said. Her voice was steady because she made it steady. She had learned that trick young. "Yes, ma'am." Harlan held out the reins, simple, no theater. She took them. Her fingers wrapped around the leather, and she pressed her forehead briefly against Rosie's warm nose, and something inside her that had been clenched for 11 days unclenched all at once. It nearly undid her entirely. She straightened, looked at him directly. "Where did you find her?" "Macready's camp, 20 miles east past the Llano River crossing." "You went into Macready's camp." She let that sit a moment. "Alone?" He did not answer that as a question because it was not one. "You could have been killed," she said. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite a flinch, not quite nothing either. "Some things were never mine to keep," he said quietly, and she did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but the words settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward that she would feel for a long time. She stared at him. He stared back. Around them, Redemption Creek held its breath. "Come inside," Lucy Holloway said. "I'll clean that cut." And that was how it began, though to understand what it meant, you had to go back to the beginning, to the version of events that started not with a returned mare and a quiet sentence, but with a woman who had learned the hard way that the West kept no promises, and a man who had spent years trying to outrun the promise he had broken. Lucy had arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1883, which was a year that started dry and mean, and stayed that way well into June. She came on the westbound stage out of San Antonio, carrying a carpetbag, a rolled map of the surrounding land grants she had purchased sight unseen, and a stubbornness that the stage driver would later describe to his wife as the most politely terrifying thing I have ever encountered in 20 years on this route. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, lean from hard traveling, and possessed of green eyes that noticed everything and gave away nothing unless she chose. She had worked as a seamstress in Kansas City for 4 years after her mother passed, saving every cent, declining every proposal from men who wanted a capable wife but had no interest in a capable woman. And when a land agent named Sutter had written her about a parcel of creek-fed acreage in central Texas with a small house already built, she had read the letter twice, counted her money, and bought the land without ever seeing it. The house turned out to be 4 walls and a leaking roof. The creek was real. The land was good if someone was willing to work it past the first 2 brutal years. Lucy chose to see only what could be made of it, because seeing only what was already there was a luxury she could not afford. Redemption Creek was a town of about 300 souls at that time. It had a general store run by Armand Delacroix, a French Creole man from Louisiana who had come west with a cotton fortune and lost it and rebuilt something smaller and steadier. It had a church with a pastor who drank too much and meant well. It had a saloon called the Dusty Ace, which was exactly what it sounded like. It had a sheriff named Cal Prout who had been a good man once and had gone soft in the middle, and was now caught somewhere between useful and merely decorative. And it had, as of about a year before Lucy's arrival, Harlan Collier. Nobody was entirely certain how Harlan had come to be in Redemption Creek. The story changed depending on who told it. Some said he had ridden through on his way elsewhere and simply stopped stopping. Some said he had done a job for Old Man Thiessen, who owned the cattle operation north of town, and that Thiessen had paid him to stay on as a kind of unofficial insurance against trouble. Some said darker things, things involving the name of a man called Deacon Pierce, who had run the southern territories of Texas with a hired army for nearly a decade before someone had systematically dismantled his operation one incident at a time over the course of 18 months. Nobody said Harlan's name in connection with Deacon Pierce out loud, but nobody had to. What the town did know, through direct observation, was that Harlan Collier was about 30 years old, that he lived in a rented room above the livery, and paid his rent on time, that he spoke to people only when they spoke first, that he was the fastest draw any of them had ever seen demonstrated under actual pressure, and that he had, on 3 separate occasions in the year before Lucy arrived, intervened in situations that Sheriff Prout had been slow to address. A robbery attempt at Delacroix's store, a dispute between a cattle drover and a homesteading family that had been escalating toward genuine violence, and a fire that had started in the alley behind the Dusty Ace and been spreading toward the neighboring homes before Harlan had organized a bucket line while everyone else was still standing in shock. He was not warm. He was not easy. But he was, in some way the town could not quite articulate, reliable. And in the West in 1883, reliability was its own kind of currency. Lucy noticed him the way she noticed everything in her new town, carefully, catalogued, filed away. She noticed the way he watched the street from the livery doorway in the late afternoon. She noticed that he was always the first person awake in the morning, which she knew because she was also always the first person awake, and she had seen his lamp burning through the livery's upper window before any other light showed in any other building. She noticed that he bought his supplies from Delacroix in modest, practical quantities, and never bought anything that wasn't necessary. She noticed the controlled quality of his stillness, the kind of stillness that is not peace but discipline, as though something underneath it needed to be held in place. She did not introduce herself for 2 months, which was longer than she went without introducing herself to anyone else in town, and she was not entirely sure why, except that the careful part of her that had learned to notice everything recognized something in him it couldn't immediately name, and her policy with unnamed things was to wait until she could name them before getting closer. The introduction, when it came, was not orchestrated. It was a Tuesday in late July, hot enough to make the air shimmer above the dirt road, and Lucy's wagon had thrown a wheel on the way back from the eastern pasture. She had gotten down and was crouching beside it with the complete attention of someone who intended to fix the problem whether or not it cooperated, when she heard hoofbeats slow and stop behind her. "Need help," said a voice. She looked up. Harlan Collier, mounted on a bay horse, watching her with an expression that was not quite neutral. There was something in it that might have been respect or might have been the beginning of curiosity. It was hard to tell. "I'm managing," she said. "I can see that," he said. "The question was whether you wanted help, not whether you needed it." She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a moment. That distinction mattered to her. "Most men didn't make it." "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He dismounted and helped her set the wheel without turning it into a performance of masculine competence, and when it was done he handed her the wrench back and said, "You're the woman who bought the Sutter parcel." "I am, Lucy Holloway, Harlan Collier." "I know," she said. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile. the suggestion of one, maybe, around the corners of his mouth. "Everyone knows," he said, and there was something wry and resigned in it, the weariness of someone who has long since stopped trying to control his own reputation. "I don't put much stock in what everyone knows," Lucy said. "I find it's usually a summary with all the interesting parts left out." He looked at her for a second longer than necessary. Then he remounted his horse. "Good luck with your pasture, Miss Holloway. Good luck with your afternoon, Mr. Collier." He rode on. She drove home, and something between them had shifted, or perhaps more accurately, something had been recognized, the way two instruments tuned to the same frequency will respond to each other across a distance. The summer wore on. Lucy planted late corn and coaxed it along with irrigation ditches she dug herself. She repaired her roof with lumber from the mill and the help of her nearest neighbor, a widow named Frances Ortega who was in her 60s and had opinions about everything and was generally correct. Frances had lived in Redemption Creek for 14 years and was the closest thing the town had to an institutional memory. "Harlan Collier," Frances said one evening, sitting on Lucy's newly solid porch and drinking the coffee Lucy had made strong enough to stand a spoon in. "You want to know about him." "I didn't ask," Lucy said. "No, but you want to know. I've been watching you not ask for 6 weeks. Frances wrapped her hands around her mug. "His family had land near Abilene. Father was a decent man, mother died young. He was the eldest of 3. Around 1876 or so, when he would have been about 23, something happened with Deacon Pierce's outfit. Most of what I know is inference, but the inference is that Pierce recruited Harlan the way Pierce recruited most of his men, not by asking, by leverage. Something he had on the family, the younger brother's debt, or something of that nature." Lucy was quiet. The crickets were starting up in the pasture grass. "He worked for Pierce for about 2 years, Frances continued. "What he did in those 2 years, I can't tell you specifically. What I can tell you is that when Pierce's operation started coming apart, Harlan was the one doing the unraveling. From inside, quietly, one thread at a time." She paused. "Sheriff in Abilene has a file on Harlan Collier. The things in it don't tell the whole story. They never do with men like that." Lucy thought about that. Thought about the kind of hidden motive that could look like treachery from the outside and be something else entirely from the inside. Thought about what it would cost a person to spend 2 years doing what needed doing and knowing it would be misread afterward. "He carries it," Lucy said. "He carries all of it," Frances agreed. "The question, I suppose, is whether he'll ever put any of it down." Lucy took a sip of her coffee and looked out at the dark pasture, where Rosie was a pale shape moving slowly through the grass, and didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she understood the particular weight of carrying things that couldn't be explained simply, and that she suspected Harlan Collier did too. August in Texas in 1883 was a season unto itself, a sustained assault of heat and light that reduced everything to its most essential quality. Lucy was in town on a Wednesday afternoon when she saw the interaction that changed her understanding of Harlan more than anything Frances had told her. A young man of about 19, a cowhand named Eli Sutter, who was no relation to the land agent but shared the name and therefore some of the associated suspicion in town, had gotten sideways with 2 of Macready's men outside the Dusty Ace. Colt Macready had not yet consolidated his grip on the Eastern Territory in the summer of 1883. That would come later in the fall, but his men were already practicing the casual menace that precedes actual tyranny, learning to read who in a town would push back and who would look away. Eli Sutter was not going to push back effectively. He was too young and too proud and too alone, and the 2 men had him backed against the saloon wall with the specific geometry of people who intend to establish a lesson rather than settle a dispute. Lucy had her hand on the knife she kept at her belt and was calculating whether she could create a sufficient disruption when Harlan stepped out of the alley between the saloon and the hardware store. He didn't draw. He didn't make a speech. He just positioned himself in the space between Eli and the 2 men, and looked at them with an expression that was perfectly extraordinarily blank. The specific quality of that blankness was what stopped them. It was the blankness of a man who has already imagined everything that could happen next and found none of the options concerning. It was the blankness of someone who has been past the line that most people are afraid of crossing, who has stood on the other side of it and come back, and who therefore cannot be effectively threatened by the suggestion of it. The two men recalibrated. One of them laughed, the kind of laugh that means retreat is being framed as choice. They moved on. Eli Sutter looked at Harlan with the expression of someone who has just been rescued and is embarrassed about it. "I had that handled," he said. "Sure," said Harlan, without any particular inflection. He didn't say anything else. He went back into the alley and was gone. Lucy, watching from across the street, let her hand fall from her knife and thought, there it is. The thing she hadn't been able to name. He used his dark past not as something to be proud of, not as a weapon to brandish, but as a resource. A tool kept in a drawer that was never opened without necessity. He was, she realized, the most controlled person she had ever observed. And somewhere underneath all that control was something she suspected was the opposite, not wildness, exactly, but depth. Intensity held at arm's length. Heat insulated behind discipline. She was in significant trouble, and she knew it, and she walked back to her wagon with the particular briskness of someone who is not going to acknowledge what they've just realized about themselves. The theft happened in September. Colt Macready had spent the summer quietly acquiring leverage over the smaller operations in the county. He had bought debt from the bank in Careville and called it in selectively. He had hired men away from smaller ranches with wages he could sustain through his cattle operation on the eastern range, and nobody else could match. He had made himself necessary to certain people by first making himself a problem that couldn't be solved without his help. He was not a subtle man, but he was a patient one, and patience in the West in 1883 was frequently mistaken for virtue. When his men rode through Redemption Creek on a Thursday evening in September, ostensibly in transit toward Careville, they moved through the town with an unhurried deliberateness that was itself a demonstration of something. They stopped at the Dusty Ace. They paid for drinks with slightly too much money, the way men do when they want to make clear they have plenty. One of them, a barrel-chested man named Devlin, whom Lucy would later learn was Macready's second, came out of the saloon and walked down toward the livery. Lucy was at Delacroix's store settling her account for the month. She did not see Devlin take Rosie. She did not see the man who was supposed to be watching the livery step away for the precise 10 minutes required, a coincidence that was not a coincidence. She came out of the store to find her mare gone, a broken hitch post, and the sound of hooves already distant to the east. The shock of it hit her in layers. First, the immediate practical horror, because Rosie was not just transportation. Rosie was the animal she had trained to work her fields, the horse without whom she could not manage the farm's heaviest operations. Then the older, deeper grief, because Rosie was also the last thing she had from before, the thread that connected her to the girl she had been in Missouri, to her mother's voice saying, "That horse is yours, Lucy, you keep her." And she had kept her through everything. She went to Sheriff Prout. Prout was sympathetic in the way of a man who is sympathetic about things he intends to do very little about. He said he would look into it. He said Macready was a complicated situation. He said that accusations against a man of Macready's standing required evidence. Lucy walked out of Prout's office before she said something she couldn't take back. She walked past the Dusty Ace, past Delacroix's store, past the church. She ended up at the livery, standing in the empty stall where Rosie had been, her hand on the side of the wooden partition, and she stood there for a while in the failing light and let herself feel the full weight of it, the betrayal, the helplessness, the specific kind of rage that comes from injustice that cannot be immediately addressed. "Miss Holloway," she turned. Harlan was standing at the livery entrance. He had come quietly, as he always came everywhere, which usually annoyed people, but at that moment she was too emptied out to have a reaction to it. "I heard," he said. "Then you know as much as I do," she said. He looked at the empty stall. Then at her. There was something in his face that she couldn't read, something that moved beneath the surface of his usual control. "Do you want me to get her back?" he asked. It was so direct that it caught her completely off guard. "Macready's men took her," she said. "You know what that means in terms of where she is." "I know what it means," he said. "Do you want me to get her back?" She looked at him for a long time. She knew in asking he was offering something that would cost him, not just the physical risk of going into Macready's camp alone, though that was real and serious, but whatever fragile peace he had built in this town, the careful equilibrium of a man who had stepped back from a certain kind of life and was trying, imperfectly, to stay stepped back. "Why would you do that?" she asked. It wasn't suspicion, exactly. It was the question of someone who needed to understand the truth of a thing before accepting it. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it's the right thing," he said, and then, quietly enough that she almost missed it, "and because she's yours." She should have said no. She had enough self-knowledge to recognize that accepting this gift from this man would change something between them that could not then be unchanged. She was already standing too close to feelings she had been careful to classify as observation rather than attachment. She said yes. She said it because Rosie was hers, and because something in her had already known what she knew about Harlan Collier, and because sometimes the careful part of a person needs to step aside and let the honest part make the decision. "Be careful," she said. Something in his expression shifted, the softest possible shift, like a door opening a quarter of an inch in a dark room and letting in just that much light. "I'll be back by Sunday," he said. He was back by Saturday evening, as it turned out, which was how Lucy came to be standing in the road watching him hold out Rosie's reins in the last red light of September, and how she said, "Come inside and I'll clean that cut," and how the story that had been building all summer finally arrived at its actual beginning. She cleaned the cut above his eyebrow at her kitchen table with water and clean cloth, which required him to sit still and her to stand close, and the proximity was not nothing, though both of them behaved as though it were. He sat straight-backed in her kitchen chair with his hands resting open on his thighs in the posture of a man who is disciplined enough not to fidget no matter what. She worked quickly and competently because she had been the person in her household who dealt with injuries since she was 12 years old. "How bad was Macready's camp?" she asked. "Well organized," he said. "About 15 men, night guard rotations. But you went in anyway. The horses were kept separate from the main camp, farther from the guards, so you found a gap and went through it," he said simply. She pressed a folded cloth against the cut. "This needs to be held for a minute." He reached up and held it. Their fingers almost touched and then didn't. "You could have been killed," she said again. It was the second time she'd said it today. She didn't care. "Possibly," he said. "That doesn't concern you." He thought about it for a moment in the way he thought about things, which was completely without hedging. "It concerns me more than it used to," he said. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She put the remaining cloth on the table and went to the stove to put the kettle on, because doing something with her hands was necessary. "Mr. Collier," she said with her back to him. "Harlan," he said. She paused, turned around. "Harlan, what you said this afternoon. About some things not being yours to keep." He was watching her with those controlled eyes, but something behind them was uncontrolled, something that had been waiting and was very tired of waiting. "I meant what I said," he said. "I know you meant it," she said. "I want to understand what you meant." He looked at her steadily. "I've been careful," he said, "for a long time, about not wanting things I don't have the right to want, about keeping a distance that I thought was appropriate, given what I am. What I've been." He stopped, started again. "But the horse was yours. Taking it back wasn't something I had the right to keep for myself as a gesture, or a way of being close to you. It was just the right thing to do, and the right thing doesn't belong to any one person." Lucy stood very still by the stove. "You've been keeping a distance," she said slowly, "that you decided was appropriate." "Yes." "Without asking me whether I agreed with your decision." A long pause, something in his posture shifted. "Yes," he said more quietly. "That seems," said Lucy Holloway, choosing her words with care, "like a decision that should have involved both of us." The kettle began to whisper. The last light outside had gone full dark, and the lamp on the table made the kitchen warm and small and close. Harlan sat in the chair looking at her with an expression she could finally read, because he was finally letting her read it, and what she read was something vast and careful and very, very honest. "Yes," he said, for the third time, but this time it sounded different. It sounded like agreement rather than admission. "Have some coffee," she said, because she was not a person who moved fast toward anything she cared about, and she needed time to understand what was happening between them at exactly the pace it was actually happening. "And tell me about Macready, because that is not a problem that ends with one recovered horse." He stayed for 3 hours that night. They talked about Macready, about Prute's failure of nerve, about the structure of leverage that Macready had built around the county's smaller operations, and how it could be dismantled. They talked with the practicality of two people who are both accustomed to solving problems rather than waiting for someone else to solve them. But underneath the practicality was something else, something that moved between them in the pauses and the moments of eye contact, and the way he leaned slightly forward when she made a particularly sharp observation, and the way she noticed exactly how far forward he leaned and what it meant. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. He put his hat on. He had come in without it, and she had forgotten he was wearing one when he was outside, which said something about how completely the last 3 hours had absorbed her. "Thank you," she said, "for Rosie. You already thanked me. I'm thanking you again." At the doorway he stopped, turned back. He was close enough that she could see the repaired cut above his eyebrow, the exhaustion that lived behind his discipline, the thing he was deciding whether to say. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "formally, if you'd allow it." Lucy had received that question before, from men who asked it quickly, with the confidence of people accustomed to yes, or with the false casualness of people who wanted to make it seem like the answer didn't matter. Harlan asked it the way he did everything, completely, with no performance attached, as though the truth of the asking was the only thing he could offer, and he was offering it entirely. "Yes," she said, "I'd allow it." October arrived, and with it a change in the quality of light that Lucy had not experienced in Texas before. A specific gold that was different from Missouri's gold or Kansas City's gray, warmer and more certain, like a last declaration before winter. She worked her farm, and Harlan called on her on Sunday afternoons, arriving exactly when he said he would, staying as long as they both wanted him to stay, leaving when the evening made it correct to leave. They talked about everything. She told him about Missouri and her mother and the debts, and the 4 years of seamstress work, and the land agent's letter that had felt like a door opening in a room she had been locked in for too long. He told her things in return, not all at once, but piece by piece, in the careful way of someone who has learned to be selective with disclosure and is choosing to be less selective, which she understood was not a small thing. He told her about his family's land near Abilene, about his younger brother Thomas, whose gambling had accumulated a debt to Deacon Pierce's operation that Pierce had used as the lever he needed, about the choice Harlan had faced in 1876 that had not felt like a choice at all: work for Pierce and keep Thomas alive, or refuse and see what Pierce did with his anger. About the 2 years that followed, which he described with the spare factual language of someone who has processed the events but not absolved himself of them, and which she listened to without flinching, because the capacity to hear hard truths without judgment was something she had worked to develop and was glad of now. "You spent 2 years dismantling his operation from inside," she said. "I spent the first 6 months deciding whether to," he said, "the next 18 doing it. And Thomas, he left Texas, he's in Oregon now, has a family." Something in his face went quieter. "He doesn't know the whole of it, what it cost." "He doesn't need to," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said, "he doesn't." A pause. "But you do." "I already did," she said gently, "or close enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Francis Ordega." Francis Ortega, Lucy confirmed. Something that was genuinely a smile moved across his face then, not the near suggestion of one she had catalogued before, but an actual smile, brief and real, and it transformed him in a way that made her chest ache pleasantly. "Of course," he said. She smiled back. Around them, the October gold settled over her farm, and the moment sat between them with the weight of something acknowledged. The problem of Macready did not wait for romance to run its course before reasserting itself, which was, Lucy thought, entirely consistent with how problems worked. In November, two of the county's smaller ranchers, men named Good and Hargrove, came to Redemption Creek with a story about being coerced into signing over grazing rights to Macready's operation through a combination of debt pressure and what Good described as a visit from men who made the nature of the alternative very clear. Prout listened. Prout sympathized. Prout sent a letter to the county seat and said they would have to wait for a circuit judge. A circuit judge, as everyone in that room knew, would not appear before spring at the earliest. Lucy went that evening to the livery and told Harlan what had happened. She had not planned to, she had planned to go home and think it through, but she was angry in a way that needed speaking, and he was the person she wanted to speak to. He listened. He always listened completely, with the full weight of his attention, which was one of the things she had come to understand was rare and to value accordingly. "The document they signed," he said when she had finished. "Was there a witness to the original coercion? Good says his hired man saw the whole exchange." "And is the hired man willing to speak to that?" "He might be, if there were someone to speak to who could actually do something with the information." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "There's a federal marshal out of San Antonio, a man named Aurelio Vega. He and I have a history, not a bad one. If I wrote to him with testimony from Good and his man and documentation of the debt instruments Macready used, Vega might be willing to make the trip." Lucy looked at him. "You're proposing to involve a federal marshal in something Macready will eventually trace back to whoever initiated it." "Yes, that's dangerous." "Less dangerous than waiting," he said. She held his gaze. In his eyes she saw the thing she had been seeing more clearly lately, that beneath the discipline and the control and the careful neutrality he presented to the world, Harlan Collier had a core of something absolute, a thing that would not bend, not out of stubbornness but out of principle, which was different, which was harder and more reliable. "Write the letter," she said. "I'll speak to Good about the testimony." He wrote the letter that night. She spoke to Good the following morning. The testimony was given in writing, witnessed by Delacroix, who had his own reasons for wanting Macready's influence curtailed, because Macready had also been quietly pressuring suppliers not to extend credit to merchants in Redemption Creek who didn't align with his interests, which included Delacroix's store. The letter went out on the Tuesday stage toward San Antonio. Now they waited. November passed into December, and December was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the Texas sky an impossible blue. Lucy had harvested what remained of her late crop and was preparing her fields for spring planting, a process that kept her busy enough to be tired by evening, and just barely not tired enough to sleep without thinking. What she was thinking about, most evenings, was Harlan. She was thinking about the way the Sunday afternoons had changed in character over the weeks. The conversations had deepened, the silences had grown more comfortable, and something between them had been building with the inevitability of weather, the kind of change that you know is coming from the quality of the air before you can see any evidence in the sky. On a Sunday in mid-December she was on her porch when he arrived, and instead of sitting at the table inside they sat on the porch, because the afternoon was sharp and clear, and the light was extraordinary. They were talking about something. She could not afterward remember exactly what, something about the spring planting and whether the creek-fed fields would respond to a different rotation, and she was watching his hands as he talked, the way he used them rarely but with precision, and she looked up from his hands to his face and found him already looking at her. not as he sometimes looked when he thought she wasn't paying attention carefully from the slight distance of someone guarding himself. This was direct, present, without guard. She stopped talking mid-sentence. He said, "Lucy," just her name. Just her first name, which he had been using for several weeks in the privacy of these afternoons, but which still sounded different every time, like something being carefully handled. "Yes," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, her left hand, which was resting on the arm of the chair, and he held it with both of his, the same deliberate gentleness he brought to everything he did, and looked at her with that complete expression she had come to trust the way she trusted the creek and the compass and the distance between stars. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. Her heart was doing something it had not done in a long time, something that felt like the moment before a leap. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately July. I want you to know that I am certain of it and that it is not a light thing and that I do not say it to pressure you toward anything. I say it because you deserve to know the truth of what I am when I'm around you, and because keeping it from you has started to feel like a betrayal of the honesty you've given me." The word betrayal, spoken in his plain, careful voice in this context, landed on her heart like a key in a lock. "Harlan," she said. "You don't have to. I'm in love with you too," she said. "I have been since approximately August, maybe July. The day you stepped between Eli Sutter and those two men in the street, and I couldn't pretend any more that what I was feeling was just observation." He looked at her. The control he usually kept so absolutely in place was gone, or not gone, rearranged, present in a different configuration. What she saw instead was the man beneath the discipline, the person who had carried things alone for too long and had been, without quite naming it, hoping for exactly this. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it briefly, with a formality that was also somehow the most tender thing she had ever experienced. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed. The blue December light lay across everything, and Lucy Holloway held Harlan Collier's hand on her porch and understood that she had not simply fallen in love, but had found something that fit the specific particular fit of two people whose histories, painful and complicated and full of secrets and dark passages, had made them exactly the shapes that matched each other. Christmas came to Redemption Creek with its small festivities. The church put on a gathering. Delacroix decorated his store windows with red ribbon. Frances Ortega made tamales in the tradition she had learned from her late husband's family, and distributed them to her neighbors with the authority of someone who considers food both gift and statement. Harlan came to Lucy's for Christmas dinner, which was the first time he had sat at her table for a meal, and the first time she had cooked for someone in that particular way, the way that has intent in it. That is as much about who you are in the making of a thing as it is about the thing itself. She made roast chicken and cornbread, and a sweet potato pie that Frances had taught her, and Harlan ate with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to show how much something means to him, and is failing slightly at the effort. After dinner they sat by the fire. She had a small fireplace she had built with the help of a stonemason in September, and he told her about Christmas as a child in Abilene, his mother making molasses cookies and his father reading to them from whatever book the circuit librarian had left in the previous season. She told him about Christmas in Missouri, the particular quality of cold there, the way the whole family had come together until they had stopped coming together, gradually and then all at once. "I used to think," she said, watching the fire, "that the West was an ending, what you came to when everything else had run out. And now," he said, she looked at him across the fire's warmth. "Now I think it's a beginning," she said, "if you're willing to do the work." He looked back at her in the firelight, and his face was open in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen it, and she thought, this is what he is under everything. Not the gunslinger's stillness, not the dark past and its weight, not the careful discipline, this here. A man sitting by a fire on Christmas, willing at last to be seen. January brought a letter back from Marshal Aurelio Vega. The letter was brief, Vega was a man who communicated in sentences rather than paragraphs, but its contents were significant. He had received Harlan's letter and the attached testimony. He had corroborating information from a separate investigation his office had been conducting regarding land fraud operations in the Central Texas Territory. He would arrive in Redemption Creek in February with a deputy and an arrest warrant for Colt Macready and 4 named associates. Harlan showed Lucy the letter at her kitchen table. She read it twice. "Devlin is one of the 4 named," she said. "Yes." "Good," she said, with a flatness that was its own kind of satisfaction. "When Vega arrives," Harlan said carefully, "Macready's men may have advance warning. Someone in the county communicates with his operation regularly. Prout or someone near him." "You think Prout is feeding Macready information?" "I think it's possible." Lucy thought about that. About the trap that could be sprung if Macready learned Vega was coming before Vega arrived. About the forced choice they might face, warn more people and risk the warning reaching Macready, or tell as few people as possible and handle whatever happened with a smaller group. "Then we tell no one except Good and Hargrove and Delacroix," she said. "People with direct reason to want Macready gone and direct risk if he isn't." "Agreed," said Harlan. She folded the letter and handed it back. Their hands touched in the exchange. They had moved past the point of pretending that was nothing. "Harlan," she said, "when this is over, when Macready is dealt with and Vega goes back to San Antonio and Redemption Creek goes back to being, whatever it will be after this, what do you want?" He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read as meaning he was considering the precise truth of something before he said it. "I want to stop moving," he said. "I've been moving since I was 23, not just physically. The way you move when you're trying not to arrive anywhere because arriving somewhere means it can be taken from you." He paused. "I'd like to arrive somewhere, if you're willing to be somewhere." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "I bought this land," she said, "because I wanted something that was mine and couldn't be taken, a place that was permanently mine." She looked at him. "I've been thinking that it might be better as ours." The words sat in the warm kitchen between them like a light that had been switched on. "Are you?" he started. "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that when this is over I'd like to talk about that properly, about what we both want and whether it matches, because I think it does, but I want to say it plainly and have you say it back." "I want to marry you," he said, with the characteristic plainness that she had come to understand was not lack of poetry but a different kind of it, the poetry of directness, of saying the exact true thing without ornamentation. "I want to marry you, and I want to build something here with you, and I want to stop being afraid of wanting it." "Then that's what we'll do," she said. "After February." February came cold and exact. Marshal Vega arrived on the 14th, which Lucy noted with private amusement was Valentine's Day, which was not widely celebrated in Central Texas in 1883, but which Francis Ortega observed with traditional enthusiasm. Vega was a compact, serious man in his late 30s, with a mustache and eyes that took in everything at once. The eyes of someone who had been a lawman for long enough that observation had become involuntary. His deputy, a young man named Callum, was earnest and efficient and jumped slightly whenever Vega spoke, which was the sign of an officer who respected his superior and had recently learned why. The arrest went as such things go when they are properly planned, with speed and the element of surprise, and a minimum of the violence that a different approach would have invited. Macready had, in fact, been warned that something was coming, as Harlan had suspected. But the warning had reached him only 24 hours before Vega arrived, which was not enough time to do more than decide whether to run, and Macready, in the arrogance of a man accustomed to being the largest problem in any given space, had decided not to run. That decision was the last one he made as a free man for a considerable time. Devlin attempted something foolish in the moment of the arrest and was restrained without being seriously hurt. The other named men surrendered with the resignation of people who had known this outcome was probable eventually. Macready said nothing when the warrant was read to him, but he looked, at some point during the proceedings, at Harlan Collier, and something was exchanged between them, recognition, perhaps, of the shape of what had happened, of how it had been done. Lucy watched from outside Good's ranch house where the arrest was made, and when it was over and Vega was loading his prisoners for the ride to Careville, she felt a particular kind of quiet move through her, not relief exactly, but the cessation of a vigilance she had been keeping without fully noticing it. Harlan came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She reached out and took his hand, there in the open, in front of Vega and Callum and Good and Hargrove, and the assembled witnesses of what was either the end of a problem or, more accurately, the clearing of ground. He held her hand the way he held everything, with complete, careful attention, like something he had been given that he intended to be worthy of. They were married in April. The ceremony was in the Redemption Creek Church, which was a building of no architectural distinction and considerable human warmth, having absorbed the weddings and funerals and confessions and ordinary Sundays of 300 people for going on 15 years. Pastor White, who had pulled himself together for the occasion with the commitment of a man who understood that some events required his best self regardless of the previous week's failings, performed the ceremony with a sincerity that moved several of the attendants to tears. Francis Ortega sat in the front pew and cried without apology. Delacroix lent his store's back room for the gathering afterward, and the town turned out in a way that surprised Lucy and did not, she thought, quite surprise Harlan, though he didn't say so. The thing about being a town was that you became, over time, invested in each other in ways that weren't always visible until they were needed. Redemption Creek had been watching Harlan Collier for 2 years with wariness and something that wanted to become more than wariness. The combination of Rosie's return and Macready's arrest had given it permission to be more. He shook hands with people she had not seen him shake hands with before, with a slight stiffness that she recognized as unfamiliarity with being included rather than merely tolerated, and she watched it ease over the course of the afternoon into something that was not quite relaxation. He was constitutionally incapable of fully relaxing in public, but was something adjacent to it. Acceptance. The early stages of belonging. Late in the afternoon, after most of the guests had gone, Lucy found him standing near the window of Delacroix's back room, looking out at the street with the expression she associated with him, thinking through something complex. "Are you all right?" she said. He turned, looked at her in her good blue dress, which was the nicest thing she owned and which she had made herself because making things herself was what she did. His expression was not complex at all. It was very simple. "Yes," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I am entirely all right." She went to him and he put his arms around her there by the window in the warm late light of their wedding day, and she pressed her face against the front of his coat and breathed. "The farm needs a second fence line," she said into his coat. She felt the slight shake of his laugh. "Already planning the spring work." "I am always planning the spring work." "I know," he said and tightened his arms. "I love that about you." Their first year of marriage was the kind that people who have both earned their peace know how to inhabit, not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty, but with the particular satisfaction of two people who have chosen each other with full knowledge, and find that the daily choosing, repeated in small actions across the span of days, is exactly as good as they thought it would be. Harlan took on work that suited the life they were building. He had a skill with horses, beyond simply riding them, a patience and intuition that made animals trust him, and he began training horses for the larger ranchers in the county, starting with Thiessen's operation and expanding as word spread. It was honest work and it paid well enough, and it let him be on the land, which suited him in a way that sitting in an office or standing behind a counter never would have. Lucy's farm expanded in the second year. She added acreage on the eastern side of the creek, the land adjacent to her original parcel that had been available since she arrived, but which she had not had the resources to purchase until the farm began genuinely producing. She grew corn and sorghum and kept a kitchen garden that produced enough to sell surplus to Delacroix through the summer, and the combination of the farm's income and Harlan's training fees made them comfortable in the way that mattered, not wealthy, not precarious, but solid, built by their own hands on ground they understood. They were good to each other in the daily ways. He woke early and had the coffee made by the time she came downstairs. She kept books meticulously and made sure their accounts were always clear. He had a temper, she discovered, not a loud temper, not the kind that filled rooms, but a cold and quiet one that manifested as withdrawal when something had genuinely angered him. And she learned to read the signal and give him space until he could speak plainly, which he always eventually did. She had a stubbornness that he had understood from the beginning was fundamental to who she was, and he had no impulse to argue with it, only occasionally to gently ask if the thing she was being stubborn about was the thing she actually wanted, which was a distinction that sometimes she needed to be asked. They talked at dinner every night. They read in the evenings, sometimes together, sometimes separately but in the same room, which was its own kind of companionship. On Sunday afternoons, the time that had been their original ritual, they still sat on the porch in good weather and inside by the fire in poor weather, and sometimes talked and sometimes were quiet, and both were good. In the second year of their marriage, in the early spring, Lucy told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen after breakfast, plainly, watching his face. His face did something entirely unguarded, a sequence of things she had rarely seen all at once. Surprise, then a kind of wondering that was almost bewilderment, then something that could only be described as joy, the pure, unconsidered kind, the kind that happens before thought catches up with feeling. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her and held her with the particular quality of holding that is not restraint but shelter, and she let herself be held, and they stood in their kitchen on a spring morning in 1885 and were, she thought, exactly where they needed to be. "Are you frightened?" he asked into her hair. "No," she said, then, "a little." "Me too," he said. "Good," she said. "We'll be frightened together then." Their son was born in September of 1885. They named him William James Collier, William for no particular person, because they wanted a name that was his own, and James for Harlan's father, because Harlan had been thinking about his father more since the pregnancy, in the way that becoming a parent often makes you re-examine the ones who made you. William James was a red-faced and thoroughly opinionated infant, who made his views on every aspect of his existence audible from the first day, and showed no sign of moderating them as the weeks passed. Lucy, who had delivered him with Francis Ortega's help, and the calm practicality she brought to every difficult physical challenge, recovered well and threw herself into motherhood with the same complete competence she threw into everything, though she was also honest about the ways in which it was hard, particularly in the first weeks, the sleeplessness, and the learning of a creature whose needs were urgent and constant, and communicated only in degrees of volume. Harlan was revelatory as a father, and not in any way she would necessarily have predicted from the controlled, solitary man she had met. He was patient with William, in the way he was patient with horses, without performance, without pretense, with a genuine attending to what the small creature actually needed rather than what was convenient. He woke for the night feedings and let Lucy sleep when he could. He talked to William in a low, quiet voice throughout the ordinary work of the day, while he was feeding the horses, while he was repairing fences, while he was doing any of the 100 things the farm required, and she would sometimes come around a corner and find him with the baby against his chest, talking about some practical matter in complete seriousness, as though William were a colleague whose opinion was being solicited. It made her love him in a new way, which she had not thought was possible because she had already loved him so thoroughly. But love was not, she was learning, a fixed quantity. It grew. It grew precisely as fast as the person you loved gave you new things to know about them. And Harlan kept giving her new things, new facets of a person who had spent so long with his light pointed inward. By spring, William was smiling with the indiscriminate generosity of a very young baby, and by summer he was sitting up and regarding the world with eyes that were, Francis Ortega declared, exactly like his father's, which means he is going to notice everything and say very little, and everyone will underestimate him, and he will not mind at all. That is the finest compliment I could receive, Harlan said. It was not about you, Francis said, though she was clearly pleased. In 1886, the town of Redemption Creek grew. The railroad's expansion plans, which had been discussed for years, became concrete, and a spur line came within 6 miles of the town, close enough to change the economics of the region significantly. New families arrived. A second store opened. A real doctor came and set up a practice, which caused general celebration since the nearest physician had previously been in Careville. Prout finally retired, or more accurately, was gently encouraged to retire by a combination of town sentiment and a meeting with the county commissioner that left him, with the clear understanding that his usefulness had reached its natural conclusion. He left without incident and was replaced by a man named Deputy Frank Acaffer, who had come to the territory 2 years before as the only black lawman in the county, had done his job with consistent competence and fairness, and who was now, finally, given the role he had earned. His appointment was not universally celebrated, because the West in 1886 was still the West, and the injustices of the era did not solve themselves simply because one corner of one county decided to do better. But in Redemption Creek, Frank Acaffer as sheriff was accepted by most with the pragmatic recognition that he had proven himself where Prout had failed, and that mattered more to most people than the color of his skin, or at least they were willing to let it matter more. Lucy and Harlan celebrated his appointment with Delacroix and Francis Ortega, and Frank himself at a dinner at their farmhouse, which was now larger than it had been. Harlan had added 2 rooms in 1885, building them himself with the methodical precision he brought to physical work, and the house was starting to feel like the kind of place that had always been there, that had grown into the landscape rather than been imposed on it. Eli Sutter came to that dinner too, grown considerably in the 3 years since the incident outside the Dusty Ace, now a young man of 22 who had been working for the Thiessen Ranch, and had recently confided to Harlan that he was thinking about starting his own small operation. Harlan had given him specific, practical advice about how to do it, and had quietly spoken to Thiessen about giving Eli a good reference, which Eli did not know and would not have expected, because he still had the lingering impression that Harlan tolerated him rather than actively liked him. He was wrong about this, as people often were about Harlan. The dinner was loud and warm and ran later than Lucy had planned, which was exactly right. William, who was 11 months old and had recently learned to pull himself to standing using the table legs, navigated the gathering with the confidence of a child who has been carried in strong arms since birth and therefore has no doubt about the fundamental security of his world. He fell asleep in the middle of the dining room floor with an abandon that made everyone who saw him do it laugh. Harlan picked him up and carried him to his crib without waking him, with the practiced ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times, and Lucy, watching from the doorway, thought of what he had said the day they married. For the first time in a long time, I am entirely all right. He was more than all right. He was arriving, she thought, fully. Every day a little more, the weight of the dark past settling into something that was still his history, but no longer his present. The secrets no longer things that needed to be kept, but things that had been spoken, and therefore no longer had the power of the unspoken. In 1887, a letter came from Thomas Collier, in Oregon. Harlan read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and then sat for a while with the letter in his hands and the expression that meant something was being turned over carefully in the deep part of him, Lucy poured them both coffee and sat across from him and waited. "He's heard some things," Harlan said finally. "About Pierce, about how it ended. Someone who knew someone who was there wrote to him." "Is he angry?" she said. "No," Harlan looked up. "He wants to come and meet you, meet William." He paused. "He says he's been carrying the knowledge that he owed me something he couldn't name, and that knowing the shape of it, even partly, has made it easier to carry." He set the letter down. "I didn't expect that. People often surprise you," she said gently, "if you let them." He looked at her across the table. "You surprised me," he said. "Good," she said. "I intend to keep doing it." Thomas Collier came in September of 1887. He was 2 years younger than Harlan, lighter in temperament, with a wife named Nora and 2 small daughters who immediately made William's life more interesting by virtue of being other small people who also had opinions and communicated them vocally. The reunion between the brothers was not dramatic in the way of theatrical productions. There was no elaborate scene of confession and absolution. It was quieter than that. 2 men who had been separated by circumstances and guilt and distance-finding, over the course of a week of shared meals and farm work and evening conversations, that they were still recognizably themselves to each other, still brothers in the way that runs deeper than explanation. On the last evening, after the children were in bed, Harlan and Thomas sat on the porch and talked for 2 hours while Lucy and Nora talked inside. Lucy could hear the low voices outside and was glad of them, glad of their continued presence, their rhythm, the evidence that something that had been broken was not broken anymore. When Thomas and his family left, Harlan stood in the road watching the wagon until it was out of sight and then turned and came back to the house, and his face was the face of someone from whom something has been lifted. Not all the way, not completely, but enough. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and this time it was not the version of the phrase that means "I am managing." It was the version that means "yes, genuinely in this moment I am." The years that followed were the years that constitute the real substance of a life, not the dramatic events, the conflicts and their resolutions, the recoveries and the arrivals, but the ordinary days stacked one against another in an accumulation that is its own kind of beauty. Lucy's farm became one of the most productive small operations in the county. She had a reputation, by the late 1880s, for knowing her land in the specific way of someone who has paid attention to it through multiple seasons and learned its particular patterns of response. She was consulted by neighboring homesteaders, and she gave her knowledge freely, because she had benefited from Francis Ortega's generosity and understood that knowledge shared was knowledge that came back compounded. Harlan's horse training operation grew to employ 2 young men from the county, both of them learning from him with the quiet intensity of apprentices who understand they are being taught something that matters. He was not an effusive teacher. He was never effusive about anything, but he was thorough and patient in the particular way of someone who has experienced the consequences of hurry and has decided that thoroughness is worth the time it requires. The Dusty Ace closed and was replaced by a more respectable establishment called the Frontier Hotel, which served food as well as drink and had 6 rooms for travelers, and which became, in the way of such places, the unofficial social center of the town now that Redemption Creek was large enough to need one. Lucy and Harlan had dinner there occasionally, on evenings when Francis Ortega was available to come and sit with William, and later with William and his younger sister, Margaret Frances Collier, who was born in 1888 and named for the grandmother who had died before she could know her, and for Francis Ortega, who was, as far as Margaret was concerned, the warmest and most interesting person in the world and a source of inexhaustible stories. Margaret was from the beginning quite different from William. William was his father's child in the way Francis had predicted, noticing everything, saying little, moving through the world with a quiet that could be mistaken for passivity, until you watched what he was actually paying attention to. Margaret was her mother's child, all focused energy and directness, and the particular stubbornness that Lucy recognized immediately and would not have changed for anything, even on the days it made her want to find a large field and scream into the distance. The four of them made a family that was sometimes noisy and sometimes quiet and always, in some irreducible way, good. Francis Ortega died in the spring of 1889, which was a loss that Redemption Creek felt collectively, and that Lucy felt personally in the way you feel the loss of someone who has been a specific kind of anchor. Not a dramatic one, not one you were leaning on obviously, but one whose presence in your landscape was so fundamental that the landscape changed shape without them. She died in her sleep in her own bed at 71 years old, which was a good age for the era and a good death, the kind that people of that generation genuinely hoped for and were grateful to receive. She had been visited the evening before by Lucy and the children, and she had sat in her chair and told Margaret a story about a snake she had seen in her garden when she first came to Texas, which was either completely true or completely invented, and which Margaret found spellbinding regardless. In her will, which she had written with great specificity over several years, and which she clearly regarded as a final opportunity to arrange things exactly as she wanted, she left Lucy her collection of pressed flowers, dried specimens from decades of Texas seasons, mounted and labeled in Francis's careful hand, and she left Harlan her husband's compass, which he had carried across half a continent 40 years before. Harlan held the compass for a long time after Lucy gave it to him. It was a beautiful thing, brass and worn smooth, still accurate. He turned it in his hands. She knew, he said. She knew everything, Lucy said. He put the compass in his breast pocket, where it stayed every day for the rest of his life. William turned 6 in 1891 and entered the newly built schoolhouse in Redemption Creek, which had a young teacher named Miss Clara Webb from Philadelphia who had come west specifically because the frontier felt, she said, like the place where things were still being decided, where what the future would look like had not yet been fixed, and she wanted to be part of fixing it. Clara Webb was an excellent teacher, which was immediately obvious to anyone who watched her work, and her arrival coincided with an expansion of the school to include older students, so that by 1892, Redemption Creek had a genuine community school serving children from ages 6 to 16. Lucy served on the school board, which was a newly formed body that Clara had helped establish, and which met monthly and made decisions about curriculum and resources, with the seriousness of people who understood that education was not decoration but foundation. Harlan attended exactly one school board meeting at Lucy's invitation and sat through it in the back of the room and said nothing, and on the walk home said, "I think you have this handled." "I do," she agreed, "but I wanted you to see it." "Why?" she considered. "Because it is something we are building for them," she said. "I wanted you to see where they will be built." He was quiet for half a block. "Yes," he said, "thank you." By 1892, they were nearly a decade into their life together. And Lucy, who had always been honest with herself about the nature of things, understood that she was happy in the settled, rooted way that is different from the young happiness of first recognition or the urgent happiness of early love. This was something deeper and wider, a happiness that included difficulty and work and the ordinary frustrations of daily life and was not diminished by them, that had room in it for grief and worry and the imperfections of two people living close together, and that remained, underneath all of it, solid and reliable as creek-fed ground. Harlan at 39 was different from the man she had met at 30. He still held himself with the controlled precision that was constitutional rather than chosen. He was still economical with words. He was still the fastest draw anyone in Redemption Creek had seen under pressure, which was a fact that mattered less with each passing year as the territory settled, and the incidents that would have required it grew rarer. But he had changed in the ways that mattered. He laughed more, quietly but genuinely. He had friends, real ones, which she did not think he had had for a long time before she knew him, Frank Acaffer, whom he had come to respect deeply, and Delacroix, who had the particular gift of seeing past people's surfaces to the human quality underneath. He showed up at community events and did not keep himself in the doorway anymore. He sat at the table. One evening in the fall of 1892, with both children asleep and the farm settled for the night, he said something to her that she would remember for the rest of her life. They were on the porch. The stars were extraordinary, the kind of display that is only possible in the open country far from any city, more stars than sky. He had her hand, as he often did in the evenings, held easily, habitually, in the way of a touch that has been repeated so many times it has become its own kind of home. "I used to think," he said slowly, looking at the sky, "that the thing I did the years with Pierce, the things I did in that time, the things I had to be, that it put me outside something, permanently, that it was the cost and there was no getting back from it. And now," she said, he looked at her. The lamp from the window made a warmth on the side of his face, and his eyes were the same eyes she had seen that first afternoon when he handed her the wrench back and made a distinction that mattered, but they were deeper now, the depth of someone who has had years of the right kinds of things fill in the hollows. "Some things were never mine to keep," he said. "I've thought a lot about what I said that day, when I brought Rosie back. I meant something particular by it then, that the act of returning her wasn't something I was keeping for myself, wasn't a debt I was creating." He paused. "But I think it also meant something else, the identity I had assigned myself. The man who forfeits the right to ordinary things because of the extraordinary things in his past, that was never real. It was a story I was telling." Another pause. "You made me see that." "I didn't do that," she said. "You did," he said, "not by telling me I was wrong, by just being honest with me, by treating me as though my history was a fact about me and not the whole truth of me." She turned to look at him, this man she had chosen and kept choosing, this person of depth and complication and absolute reliability, this gunslinger who had ridden 20 miles alone into an armed camp to return a horse that was not his, who had then stood in the road in the dying light and said 4 quiet words that she now understood were the most fully meant words she had ever heard. "Harlan," she said. "Yes. I love you very much." He brought her hand to his mouth, pressed his lips to her knuckles, looked at her over them with eyes that were completely open. "I love you," he said, "in a way I did not know I was capable of before you." The stars went on above them in their incomprehensible multitude, and the farm was quiet, and the children slept, and the creek ran cold and clear in the dark beyond the fields, and Lucy Holloway, who had come to Redemption Creek with a carpetbag and a map and a stubbornness that would not be argued with, sat on the porch of the home she had built with her own hands and looked at the man she had built a life with and thought, "Yes, this is exactly where I am supposed to be." The spring of 1893 brought new grass and the smell of the creek rising, and Lucy planted her best season yet. The fields were deep worked and well fed after a decade of careful tending, and the soil responded with the faithfulness of something that has been treated with honesty and respect. Harlan expanded the horse training by spring into a small formal operation. A proper paddock, 3 training horses, a contract with the county sheriff's office for horse assessment, and young Eli Sutter, who had finally gotten his own small ranch going by this point, as his first contracted client for 2 young horses that needed working. Frank Acaffer stopped by in April to tell them that the county commissioner had proposed naming the new water collection facility, a jointly funded project to serve the expanding population of the area, after Armand Delacroix, who had served the town for going on 2 decades with consistent and genuine care. Delacroix, when told, cried quietly and then offered everyone present a free sack of flour, which was exactly the response everyone expected and everyone was glad of. William at 7 had developed a specific passion for botany. He had found, in the collection of pressed flowers Francis Ortega had left his mother, a world that absorbed him completely, and Lucy was quietly planning how to get him more books on the subject, which meant writing to a bookseller in San Antonio and waiting, but waiting was something she had always been good at. Margaret at 4 was learning to ride, a process she had demanded with the specific authority of a child who has decided something is happening and is simply notifying the adults of this fact. Harlan was teaching her with the same patient exactness he brought to teaching every animal and every person, and Margaret, on Rosie, who was now 17 years old and moving more slowly but still steady and sweet-natured as she had always been, was already sitting straight and easy in the saddle, her small face set with the expression of someone who has found their element. Lucy watched them from the fence one afternoon, Harlan on foot beside Rosie, one hand lightly on the bridle, Margaret above him with her chin up and her eyes bright, and the scene was so right, so completely the thing it was supposed to be, that she had to hold the fence post for a moment just to keep herself anchored. Rosie, the horse that had started all of it, still here, still carrying the family forward. They were expecting their third child in December of 1893. Lucy had told Harlan on a Tuesday, again in the kitchen, and again the sequence of things had moved across his face, but this time without the bewilderment, because he knew now what a child meant for them, had the evidence of 2 already, and so the sequence went from surprise to the joy immediately, unobstructed. He sat down and pulled her into his arms, right there at the kitchen table, and she sat on his lap like she was 26 again and not 36, and he held her with both arms and she felt the steady beat of his heart under her cheek. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she agreed. "Boy or girl, do you think?" he said. "I have no idea," she said. "And I love that we won't know until we do." The baby came in December, a son, born in the early morning hours of a clear, cold day, and they named him Samuel Ortega Collier Samuel, because it was Harlan's middle name that she had not known until they were filling out their marriage paperwork, and had filed away for exactly this purpose. And Ortega because, of course, because some debts of the heart are paid in the names we carry forward. Samuel was a quiet, curious baby, which seemed impossible given the decibel level Margaret had established as the family standard, but he was genuinely so, watching the world from his first weeks with a thoughtful expression that made Harlan laugh every time he saw it. "He looks like he's taking notes," Harlan said. "Good," Lucy said. "He comes by it honestly." By 1895, they had been in Redemption Creek for 12 years, and the town had changed substantially from the rough, uncertain settlement Lucy had arrived in. It had a proper main street, 2 churches, a full school, a hotel, a doctor, a dentist who visited monthly from Careville, and Sheriff Ockafer's office, which maintained the peace with a fairness that had become the standard against which other things in the town were measured. The railroad spur 6 miles out had changed everything about commerce. Goods came in more easily, prices stabilized. The isolation that had been a defining condition of frontier life softened enough to be manageable. Young people came to the area as it became more established. Old-timers like Delacroix watched it become something they had both wanted and not entirely expected, the strange sensation of having outlasted the worst of what made it hard. Harlan's reputation had changed completely in those 12 years, not through dramatic revision. No single event had rewritten how the town saw him, but through the accumulation of ordinary evidence. He was a fair man who trained good horses. He was a steady man who kept his word. He was a husband who showed up when his wife needed something and also when she didn't, who participated in the community at the level it asked of him, who taught young men the things he knew without making them feel small for not knowing them already. He was a father whose children were visibly, completely loved. The dark past was still there. A man's history doesn't vanish because his present is good. But the past had been put in its proper place, which was behind him, which was the only place it had ever belonged. One afternoon in September of 1895, Harlan was in the paddock working with a young horse when he heard the sound of hooves on the road and looked up to see a man he didn't recognize immediately riding past, a traveler, clearly heading west. The man slowed, looked at the paddock, looked at Harlan, and something in his posture suggested a question. Harlan walked to the fence. "Is this the Collier place?" The man said. "It is," said Harlan. "I heard there was a man in Redemption Creek who could assess a horse. Help me figure out if what I bought in Careville was worth what I paid." "I can do that," Harlan said. "Pull in." The man pulled in. His horse was a decent animal, somewhat poorly conditioned, underweight for its frame, with better bone structure than its current state suggested. Harlan walked around it, put a hand on its shoulder, checked its feet, looked at its teeth. The man watched him work and said nothing while he worked, which was a good sign. "You paid too much by about a third," Harlan said, "but the horse itself is worth the work. Month of proper feeding and conditioning, she'll be what you wanted her to be." The man looked at him. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," said Harlan. The man nodded slowly. He glanced around at the farm, the fields, the house, the paddock, the creek visible through the trees. At William, who had come around from the back of the house and was watching from a polite distance with his characteristic quiet attention. "Good place," the man said. "Yes," said Harlan. He looked at it the way he always looked at it, the way you look at something that took a long time to arrive at and that you intend to look at carefully forever, not taking it for granted. "It is a very good place." The man rode on. Harlan went back to his horse. William came to lean on the paddock fence and watch his father work, and after a while William said, "Papa, why does that horse hold her right foreleg differently than the others?" "Because she's compensating for something," Harlan said. He showed William what he meant. William watched with total attention, and Harlan taught him, as he had been teaching him everything he knew since the boy was old enough to walk at his side, and the afternoon went on in its golden September way, 1 hour into the next. Lucy found Harlan that evening sitting on the porch with Samuel asleep on his chest and the compass in his open hand, turning it slowly in the last light. She came out and sat beside him with a cup of coffee, and he tipped his head toward her in the easy way of someone who knows the other person so well that language is often unnecessary. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he confirmed. He looked at the compass. "Do you know what I've been thinking about? Tell me. The first day, when I brought Rosie back. I think about that day often," she said. "I said something I meant," he said, "that I didn't fully understand yet. You said some things were never mine to keep." "Yes," he closed his hand around the compass. "I understand it now, all the way through. The guilt I was keeping, the limitation I was keeping, the one that said I didn't get to have this." He looked at her. "None of it was mine to keep. They were things I was holding onto because I thought they belonged to me, but they weren't mine. They were just things I was carrying that I could have put down a long time ago." "You put them down," she said. "You helped me." "You did the work," she said firmly. He shook his head slightly. "We did the work," he said. "That's what I mean. It's not mine to keep either, the credit." He looked down at Samuel sleeping on his chest with the complete confidence of a small person in a safe place. "Or this, or any of it. It's not mine to keep alone. It's ours." Lucy set her coffee cup down. She reached over and put her hand over his, over the compass, over the closed warmth of it. "Ours," she said. The words sat between them in the evening air, in the late light of a September that smelled of harvest and creek water and the particular richness of worked earth. And around them, the farm was quiet in its productive, breathing way. And inside the house, William was reading by lamplight and Margaret was inventing some complicated game that involved all 3 of her dolls and at least 2 of the kitchen chairs. And Samuel slept on his father's chest with his small face turned toward the warmth. And Redemption Creek settled into its evening routines a 1/4 mile away, and the creek ran its course as it always had through the fields, faithful and unhurried, not knowing what it meant to anyone, but meaning everything to those who knew it. Harlan Collier, former gunslinger, former instrument of a man he had helped bring down, former man who believed he had forfeited his right to ordinary good things, sat on the porch of the home he had helped build and held the compass that pointed true north as it always did, and held the hand of the woman who had looked at the whole truth of him and said, "Come inside. I'll clean that cut," and was more fully arrived in his own life than he had known it was possible to be. Lucy Holloway Collier, woman who had come west with a carpetbag and a map and more stubbornness than good sense. Woman who had coaxed good things from difficult ground her whole life and understood it as the essential work. Looked at the man beside her and the baby on his chest and the stars coming up over the creek fields and thought, as she had thought on that September evening a decade ago when he had stood in the road with a mare's reins in his hand and said the four quietest, most permanent words she had ever heard. Yes, this is exactly where I am supposed to be. And it was, and it remained so for all the years that came after. The growing children and the growing farm and the growing town, and the ordinary extraordinary days that stack up one against another in a life built by two people who found each other in the dust and the difficult and the hard, honest work of the frontier, and chose each other, and kept choosing, and were glad every day of the choosing.